This is the first lecture for the chapter on social psychology. Social psychology is considered the marriage or the discipline that runs, it's sort of the marriage, if you will, of the social and the psychological, hence the name social psychology, right? You can think of, so this chapter, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get everything all organized here, but this chapter is right up my alley because it assumes that there is a relationship between what is going on in one's mind and one's brain, how one's psychology is processing, and the social environment. So kind of like in the last chapter where we were talking about social cognitive theory, how what happens here affects how I act, and how I act influences how people act towards me. That's sort of what the whole chapter about social psychology is about. A couple words that, a couple phrases that you'll hear me make reference to that you should be familiar with by now are something called cognitions. And remember, cognitions refers to thinking. So we're talking about social cognitions, in other words, how I think about the social environment or how the social environment affects how I think, right? In this chapter, we've got a whole bunch of phrases that will cover person perception. There's an activity on attribution, which is a fancy way of saying how do you explain, how do you attribute someone's behavior. Attitudes, love, there's a scale where you can take to learn a little bit about your love language. Prejudice and how prejudice, so there's this idea that we all carry around an implicit bias, and an implicit bias is a kind of prejudgment. So I've created an assignment where you can test your implicit bias. Conformity, which is described as how we follow the rules of others, and there are a couple classic research projects. One is called the Milgram teacher-learner experiment. That one actually measures authority more than conformity. And then there's the Ash line experiment. These were both. And then the last one that's also considered classic, and it's about obedience and conformity. It is the Stanford prison experiment. And all three of those came about in the 1970s. They were really kind of began in the late 60s. They were in response to the Second World War and the Holocaust. So we got those three topics: pro-social behavior, which is a fancy way of saying helping behavior. This is not the same thing as antisocial behavior. Well, it is antisocial behavior, but antisocial does not mean that you like to hang out in your own apartment. Those phrases get used incorrectly. And then the last one is just a list of phrases relative to behavior in groups. So there's a lot of activities that go with this chapter. I've tried to make them as short and concise as possible. So person perception, the idea here is that there are four sort of principles, I guess for lack of a better word, that predict or influence how we're going to think about, how we're going to perceive other people. The first sort of principle is that there is no like right and wrong perception. Perception is not a reality. It's not something that we can measure. It's simply a subjective interpretation of events. So what we see and what is real are, should not assume that those are necessarily the same thing. How we interpret or how we perceive people will predict how we respond to them. How we perceive people will also be determined as how we, what my objective here is. So what do I want in this situation, or what are my goals in this situation? And then what are people normally supposed to do in this situation? I don't know if it's the example in the book or if it's just one I've thought of over the years, but one I kind of think about is if you're trying to like sit down, say on a subway or on a bus, or maybe sit down in church or something, and there's a lot of space in between the person sitting there, or maybe that person is sitting in your space. place. So your goal is to sit down, and the normal behavior in the situation, everyone knows that's your pew in church, and that person is not sitting down and not scooting over. So you will evaluate them in a negative way because they are inhibiting your ability to do what you need to do, and those are not the rules. Maybe another example would be is that you're in a hurry in the grocery store and you're in the express lane, and the person in front of you has 12 items and the limit is 11 items, right? So your goal is to get in and out very quickly. They're not following the social norm, so you will think of them in a very negative way. That person is dumb, that person is rude, but you will perceive others. These to me are useful considerations. I'm always trying to become less judgmental of people. And so as you embrace or as you find yourself inclined to judge people, ask yourself, like, why do I think that? Like, what is this person really acting inappropriately, or am I just trying to get somewhere that I can't get? So like when I worked at when I was working at the fabric store, you never go to the fabric store in a hurry. It always takes a long time, and people would come in and they would be in a rush, right? And they would want me to hurry up. So they were judging me poorly because they were in a rush. Well, the same thing was I was judging them poorly because the norm is you should not go to cut fabric in a rush, right? You need to have plenty of time. That is the norm, that we all follow these rules. Maybe the post offices, and I always say never go to the post office in a hurry. Okay, so here's some other fancy terms that go along with what we call social categorization. And if you were to take a sociology class, we will talk about all of these things in the sociology class too. But these are the social psychology terms for effectively the same thing. I'm trying to see if I actually have all these words spelled right. So the big assignment that I linked up here after the first lecture, and I debate if I should put it towards the end of the lectures, into the chapter, the beginning, but it asks you to explore your implicit. So remember, there's what we call explicit and implicit. The way you can keep these terms straight is you have X, EX like exit, and I like in. So an explicit cognition is something that you are aware of or something that you declare. These are your conscious evaluations about people, that that you think of old people differently than you think of young people. Or you hold biases towards, I don't know, Chiefs fan versus Broncos fan, right? Those are your conscious ones. Those are ones that we say, oh, I really need to change the way I think about that because we're aware of them. Your implicit ones, these are the ones that are potentially more dangerous because we aren't aware of them. So Harvard University proposed or created this assessment, and it's called the implicit, it's the fiddlesticks. I forget the name of it, but it's in the assignment, and you have to go to the Harvard website in order to take this assessment. The one that I've specifically asked you to do for classroom credit is the race one, but you can also take a Harvard implicit bias assessment about old people, about body size. I think you can take them by, yeah, you got age, you got body size, you got political identity. I think there's one about guns. There's all kinds of different assessments, but what they're attempting to sort of get at is our biases that are so, remember we were talking about personality and the Freudian, but they're so ingrained below our conscious level that we're not even aware of them. And then why do these matter? Because in theory, these matter because we treat people different. I believe also after this lecture, I queued up another, it's not an assessment, it's a video about another kind of implicit bias, one that we probably don't like to acknowledge, and it's called the halo effect. And the halo effect, I do not believe the halo effect is actually a term from this textbook, but the halo effect is how we regard attractive people differently than unattractive people. And this has been demonstrated over and over again. And what you see in this particular experiment is you have a what they're calling traditionally attractive person, and then a plainer person, and they both need help. And who gets help faster? Who gets help more often? And the thought is that why these implicits, why these ideas are important is because they influence how we treat people and how we act towards people. And that's the difference between bias and discrimination. But that's a couple slides down. A couple other terms that I want to highlight here are stereotypes. We use that term all the time, but the best way to think about stereotypes are that's when we overgeneralize, right? And so this picture is an attempt to, show you, that we see people presented in a certain way, and we put them in a box, we put them in a category. Stereotypes work from a psychological perspective, and this is a really important term, but it's not in your book, so I don't have it bolded here. And that's what's called a cognitive shortcut, right? I mean, we're inclined to say, oh, stereotypes are terrible, they're always bad. But the reality is one, they're not always bad, right? Sometimes you have positive stereotypes, but they're a psychological response to a lot of information coming. They're kind of like the schemas, going back to the chapter on memory. There's a lot of information coming in, so we summarize it. We cannot remember every possible athlete we've ever met, so we create in our mind these cognitive shortcuts. And the thing I think is also worth noting about these cognitive stereotypical shortcuts is sometimes they're referred to as having a kernel of truth. They came from somewhere, and in some instances, and maybe in a lot of instances, that would have been a correct conclusion to make. But we have overgeneralized these conclusions, and we've applied them to too many people. And I think I'm going to stop this video right here, and in the next one, I will continue talking more about attribution and attribution bias.